It's quite rare to find true crab apples these days. They're usually hybridized with cultivated varieties. But some of the traits of true crab apples are a long stalk and a longer calyx relative to the size of the fruit. Crab apples often turn yellow when ripe, or sometimes pink or red. So these apples have all three of those traits. So these are either true crab apples or very closely related to them. The good thing is, all apple or malus species are edible, whether it's crab apples or any feral species of cultivated apples that you might find. And here's another crab apple tree. These ones aren't quite as yellow, but you see they do still have that longer calyx at the bottom of the fruit, whereas most cultivated apples have quite a short calyx. There's one thing that all apple or malus species have in common though. So if you cut an apple in half along its width, it'll have a star-shaped chamber. You see that, where the seeds are? Crab apples are best around September and October. Easy way to check if they're ripe, just bite one in half and look at the seeds. If the seeds are brown like that, then the fruit is ripe. If the seeds are white, then the fruit isn't quite ready yet and probably need a few more weeks. Just like with all cultivated apples, the seeds are mildly toxic, so it's a good idea not to consume them. But if you do accidentally swallow one or two, I'm sure that's not going to do any harm. The only real difference between cooking apples and eating apples is how sour and astringent they are, and that really comes down to personal preference. Most people find crab apples much too sour to eat raw. I actually don't mind them because I quite like sour flavours. But crab apples are perfect for pies, chutneys, jams, and because they're very high in pectin, you can add them to jams and jellies to help them set. Crab apples generally have fruits that are around 2 or 3 centimetres wide, though they can be much larger if they're hybridized with cultivated apples. The leaves are oval with a toothed margin, and they're around 6 to 10 centimetres long. From a distance, they could be mistaken for yellow cherry plums. They're about the same size and similar colour. When you get up closer, you can see they've got the calyx on the bottom of the fruit. Acorns are often overlooked as a food source, probably because it takes a lot of effort to process them. But from a survival or self-sufficiency point of view, they're a reliable source of healthy fats and proteins. Acorns are high in tannins, which makes them far too bitter to consume without processing, and they could cause an upset stomach. So they need to be leached in several changes of water to remove most of the tannins. I'll make a video soon on the whole process from foraging to cooking with acorns. You want to collect your acorns when the shells are brown, like this, and it's best to wait until they've dropped from the tree and collect them from the floor, rather than trying to take them off the tree, because they'll probably be unripe still. So around September or early October, find a woodland that's got some nice big mature oak trees in it, and then check around the base for any acorns. So as I said, you want a nice brown shell like this, not the green ones. And you also want to make sure they don't have a hole in like that, because that means that the acorn inside has been consumed by a weevil. So that's a dud. So just check that they've got a nice smooth shell with no holes in. And you can also tell by the weight, like a single acorn that's good is roughly about the weight of a pound coin, whereas the ones that have been eaten by a weevil are really light. There's no weight to that at all. And another way to test if they're duds is when you get home, drop them into a bowl of water and they should sink. Any that float are no good and you can discard them. As you can see, there's absolute masses of these acorns here. Now look, this one's started to sprout. I'll find a little clearing in the woodland and plant this one. If you crack the shell of one of the acorns, you'll see there's quite a substantial amount of meat in a single acorn. So you can see why it's a good source of food. Although it's not a good idea to eat any amount of these raw, it's okay to have a little nibble. That won't do any harm. And you can see they're really unpalatable raw, very bitter. Some really nice sized ones here. And if you're trying to live a more self-sufficient life, you could easily collect enough of these from a few mature oak trees in autumn and dry them and keep them for the rest of the year. If you want, you can make flour out of them for making pancakes, or like in the more in-depth video that I'm going to make soon, I'll show you how once you've leached them of the tannins, you can crush them up and roast them, and then you can use them in a similar way to hazelnuts. This time of year really is amazing. There's such an abundance of wild foods. Back in May, part 1 of this foraging calendar series, we looked at spare-leaved orache and how you can forage its greens, and now you can also forage its seed pods, and these are available from September through to around November. So you can just eat these raw if you like. They're quite nice and crunchy with a salty flavour. And you can also add them into soups as a thickener. So you'll see there's lots of clusters of these seed pods, and they consist of 2 triangular bracts that enclose a single seed. You get absolutely masses of them all over these plants in autumn. And spear-leaved orache is a very common plant all around coastlines and in estuaries. These are fairy ring champignons, also known as fairy ring mushrooms or sometimes Scotch bonnet. These are a very common mushroom that can be found anytime from spring through to late autumn. I find that September is by far the best month for them in my area. These are a grassland species, and you can often find them growing in rings or fairy rings. You can see there's a dense ring of them here. Just be aware that these aren't the only mushrooms that grow in rings. There are other similar looking mushrooms, such as the false funnel, which is deadly poisonous. They also grow in rings, so you do need to be careful. So fairy ring champignons should be avoided by beginner foragers. However, once you're comfortable with identifying this mushroom, they're a really good one to know because they're nice and tasty. They've got a slightly sweet, nutty flavour, and also they're very, very common. In September, I see these growing in just about every grassland. And my favourite use for these is making mushroom pâté. And they're popping up everywhere now in September because we've had quite a lot of heavy rain recently. You might have to brush through the grass to find the best ones. That's a perfect one there. The caps of fairy ring champignons are generally between 2 and 5 centimeters wide. When they're younger, they're convex like this, and then they start to flatten out with age, and they have a broad umbo in the center. They can vary between a yellowish ochre to tan brown color, and they're usually a bit darker in the center around the umbo. In dry conditions, these caps dry out and become much paler. They have faint striations around the margin. The gills are initially white, and then as they get older, they become more of a pale yellow to ochre colour. The gills are distant, or they have spaces between them, and it's very important to note that the gills are free or not attached to the stem. This is one of the main differences between this edible fairy ring champignon and the deadly false funnel, because the false funnel has gills that are decurrent or run down the stem. So you want to make sure that they're free of the stem. The stems are slim and quite tough and fibrous, and they're a sort of lighter pale yellow to brown colour at the apex, and they become darker towards the base. And also there's no ring or skirt on the stem. The flesh is white or sometimes slightly pale yellow on older specimens, and it has a faint sort of sawdust smell. They're at their best about this sort of stage before the caps have flattened out. I'd say fairy ring champignons are probably the mushroom that I eat the most of. They've got a long growing season and they're one of the easiest mushrooms to find, and also they're really tasty. I visit this spot every September because I can almost guarantee that these mushrooms will be growing here, and you can see there's loads of tiny ones here just pinning, so there's going to be a lot more growing here over the next few weeks. See, they're absolutely tiny. Alright, that should do me for some pate.